Welcome to another quiet journey into the strange, slow rhythm of history. Tonight, we're drifting back, not into the world of kings and knights you've seen in movies, but into something far more ordinary and far stranger. Before we continue on this journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you love listening history while going to sleep. You may leave a comment. What time are you watching? Imagine yourself living in a small medieval town. The streets are narrow and lined with timbered houses leaning into each other, their upper floors almost touching above your head. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and damp straw. A bell tolls somewhere in the distance, marking the hour, though you're not entirely sure which hour, because clocks aren't common yet. You adjust your rough wool cloak and step carefully to avoid the puddles of waste that trickle between the cobblestones. Around you, people move with quiet purpose: apprentices, traders, bakers, and farmers. Everyone knows their place, and everyone knows that even the smallest mistake, wearing the wrong fabric, selling the wrong bread, or brewing beer at the wrong strength, could bring punishment. The laws of the medieval world were everywhere, woven tightly into daily life. But unlike the neat, numbered laws of today, these were often unpredictable, shaped by the whims of lords, guilds, and the church. Some of them were practical, others made very little sense, and yet, breaking one could mean losing everything. Tonight, we'll explore the world of bizarre laws in medieval Europe you'd never expect. From the rules that told you what you could wear, to the taxes on everyday habits, to punishments so peculiar you might think they were invented as a joke. So, take a deep breath, let your body relax, and imagine yourself living in a time when the law wasn't written in a book, but lived, breathed, and watched you from every corner of your world. Let's begin with the people who suffered most from these strange decrees, the common folk. Imagine waking up in a one-room cottage at dawn. The floor beneath you is cold earth. The fire has gone out during the night, and the air is damp and chill. You rub your hands together, pulling your thin blanket close. The rooster outside crows. It's time to start another day under a system that controls almost everything you do. You live under manorial law, set of local rules that are as changeable as the weather. They are decided not by distant kings, but by the lord of the manor you serve. His steward or bailiff will visit the village every few weeks to ensure everyone is behaving properly. And in this time, behaving properly means following hundreds of small, intricate, and often confusing laws. Let us start with what might seem the most personal and most peculiar rule of all: what you were allowed to wear. In much of medieval Europe, clothing wasn't simply a matter of taste or fashion, it was a form of social control. Sumptuary laws dictated which colors, fabrics, and even accessories you could own. If you were a peasant, you were expected to look like one. In England, for instance, a law in the 14th century declared that only knights and their wives could wear silk or velvet. Lesser men were restricted to coarse wool or linen. If you dared to wear something above your station, you could be fined or even jailed. The idea was simple: society should look the way it's structured. Everyone had a place, and clothing was one of the clearest ways to show that place. So imagine standing in the market, watching a merchant's wife sweep by in a gown trimmed with fur. You might envy her, but you could never imitate her. The law itself would stop you. For the rich, these laws were flattering. For everyone else, they were another reminder that life wasn't meant to change. If you were a craftsman or a trader, the laws became even trickier. Medieval towns were ruled not only by kings and lords, but by guilds, powerful organizations that controlled each trade. Bakers, blacksmiths, tanners, weavers all had their guilds, and all had strict rules about how their craft was practiced. You couldn't just decide to open a shop. You had to earn the right of in through years of apprenticeship, fees, and approval from the guildmasters. Once you were part of a guild, you had to follow their laws. You couldn't sell your bread too large or too small. You couldn't brew ale that was too weak or too strong. You couldn't make cloth of a certain quality unless you belonged to the right level of your guild. And if you broke those laws, you might find yourself standing before the town pillory, where everyone could see your shame. Some towns even had laws about when you could sell things. Bakers couldn't open their ovens before dawn. Butchers couldn't slaughter animals on certain days, and markets often had quiet hours, enforced by the ringing of a bell. Every sound, every smell, every exchange in a medieval market happened under the watchful eye of the law. It wasn't just about keeping order, it was about keeping power making. Sure, no one rose too quickly, No one sold too cheaply. No one broke the invisible chain that kept the social order intact. And then there were the punishments. They were often less about justice and more about spectacle. If you were caught selling spoiled meat, you might be forced to carry it through the streets, a sign around your neck declaring your crime. If you baked bread that was too light, cheating customers out of their full weight, you could be tied to your bakery door with your bad loaves around your neck. Public humiliation was considered cleansing. It reminded the community of order. Even animals weren't safe from the law. There are records of pigs being put on trial for crimes like injuring a child. They were dressed in human clothes and tried before a court. Of course, the outcome was always the same, but the ritual mattered. It might seem absurd now, but these acts reflected the medieval belief that law was divine. Every sin or crime, no matter how small, disrupted the balance of the world, and that balance had to be restored, even if it meant sentencing a rooster to death for crowing on the wrong day. For most commoners, the law wasn't written down. It was lived through whispers, traditions, and memories. You didn't know every rule. You just knew what not to do because someone, somewhere, had been punished for it. You couldn't move away from your village without permission. You couldn't marry outside your manor's boundaries. You couldn't cut down trees in the forest or hunt the deer that wandered close to your fields, because all of it belonged to the Lord. Every part of your life, your clothes, your work, your food, even your leisure, was defined by law. And yet, despite the absurdity of many rules, people found ways to bend them. Villagers might secretly brew stronger ale in the back room. Women might trade forbidden fabrics through whispers and hidden baskets. And in the quiet of the night, when the fires burned low, they might laugh softly about the foolishness of it all. Because even in the strictest systems, there's always room for a small act of rebellion. As the candle burns low in your imagined cottage, you might realize something curious. For all the differences between their world and ours, medieval people weren't so unlike us. They, too, lived under laws that sometimes made little sense. They, too, balanced between obedience and defiance. And they, too, found small comforts in the steady rhythm of daily life, even when that rhythm was dictated by someone else's rule. And now that we've walked through the narrow, rule-bound life of the medieval commoner, let's turn our gaze upward to those who made the laws. In the next segment, we'll meet one of the most intriguing figures in this tangled web of medieval justice, a man whose obsession with order and morality changed the law itself. Imagine, for a moment, that the soft hum of the village fades away. The crackle of hearth fires and the chatter of the marketplace dissolve into something quieter, colder, more deliberate. You're standing now in a royal hall. The walls are stone, the air heavy with the scent of wax and parchment. Long tables stretch before you, covered in scrolls, ink pots, and wax seals. A fire burns low in a great hearth at one end, and above it, watching silently, is the stern figure of the king himself, Henry II of England. It is the 12th century, and this man, restless and sharp, is about to change how justice itself is done. Henry was not an idle ruler. He was constantly in motion, riding across his sprawling empire from Scotland to southern France, dictating letters as he went, scribes clattering behind him. He was a man of contradictions, fiercely intelligent, easily angered, endlessly curious. To his friends, he was brilliant. To his enemies, he was a storm. But above all, Henry hated chaos. And in medieval Europe, chaos was what law looked like. Every town had its own customs, every village its own rules. The church held its courts, lords held theirs, and royal justice, if it existed at all, was reserved for the few who could afford to reach it. To Henry, that was intolerable. He wanted order, predictability, a system that would make the law the same for everyone, at least in theory. So, sometime around 1166, he began to build something new, the common law. It began with something deceptively simple: inquiry. Henry ordered that royal judges would travel across the land, holding sessions called assize. They would hear cases from ordinary people, not just nobles. They would apply the king's law, not the Lord's. And to find the truth of a matter, they would use something radical: a jury. Not a modern jury as we know it, of course. These juries were made up of local men who swore an oath to tell what they knew about a case. They weren't asked to decide guilt or innocence. They were asked simply to reveal the truth, as best they could. But even that was revolutionary. For the first time, justice wasn't just dictated from above, it was drawn out from the knowledge of ordinary people. The king's courts began to gather patterns, rules, precedents, and procedures that would one day become the foundation of English law, and eventually the law in much of the modern world. Yet for all his reforms, Henry was not a gentle ruler. His interest in justice was not entirely selfless. The more the king's courts handled, the more fines they collected. The more cases came before royal judges, the stronger the crown became. Justice was power, and Henry understood that perfectly. He reorganized the courts, demanded written records, and introduced new forms of legal proof. He even ordered that trials involving property could be decided by what was called a rito royal document that allowed someone to summon another to court. It was a way to bypass local lords, to make the king's justice the only justice that mattered. Imagine the sound of those scribes, their quills scratching across vellum as they wrote in careful Latin. Imagine the wax seals pressed down warm, fragrant, heavy with meaning, each one a small echo of power sent out into the land. But Henry's vision for order met its fiercest resistance, not from rebels or barons but from the church. His one-time friend, Thomas Becket, had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry had expected him to be compliant, a man who would help bring church law under royal control. But Becket changed. He took his religious duties seriously for Henry's liking. When Henry demanded that churchmen accused of crimes be tried in royal courts, Becket refused. The two men clashed publicly and bitterly. Becket fled into exile. Years later, when he returned, the tension between them was unbearable. And then came that fateful night in 1170, in a fit of frustration. Henry is said to have muttered words that would haunt him forever. "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" 4 knights took that as a command. They rode to Canterbury Cathedral, and there, in the cold stone silence of the church, they struck down the archbishop. Becket was killed at the altar, and almost immediately he was hailed as a martyr. Henry's quest for order had brought about one of the most infamous acts of violence in medieval Europe. When news of Becket's death spread, Henry's world turned against him. The Pope threatened excommunication. His subjects murmured of divine punishment. And so, in one of history's strangest acts of penance, the most powerful man in England stripped off his royal robes, put on a simple woolen tunic, and walked barefoot to Canterbury. There, at Becket's tomb, he knelt before the monks. One by one, they struck him across the back with birch rods, 50 lashes in all. A king, beaten in silence. The lawgiver, humbled before the law of heaven. The image is quiet, haunting, and perfectly medieval. A world where power was bound to penance, where kings could command armies but still feared the eternal balance of sin and judgment. Despite the tragedy, Henry's reforms endured. The system he built continued to grow, recorded, refined, and taught by clerks in candlelit chambers. His Assize of Clarendon laid the groundwork for trial by jury. His itinerant justices became the model for national courts, and the idea that law should be written, consistent, and appealable to the crown became one of England's greatest legacies. If you trace the lines far enough, you'll find echoes of Henry's reforms in modern courts. Even now, the calm, procedural tone of justice, the belief that the law should apply equally, at least in principle, and the strange, comforting idea that order can be built from chaos. The hall grows quiet again. The king's footsteps fade down the corridor, and the wax seals cool on the parchment. The world he left behind was far from perfect, but it was more structured, more predictable, more aware of itself. It was, in its way, the beginning of the modern mind. As we leave Henry's candlelit chamber, we'll step into something different, a mystery that lies buried beneath the stone floors of Europe. In the next segment, we'll wander through ancient vaults and forgotten tunnels, tracing the strange remains of laws, punishments, and customs that time tried to erase. The sound of the royal court fades, and in its place comes something softer, an echoing drip of water, a low hum of air through stone, the faintest creak of wood. You find yourself in a cold, dimly lit cellar beneath a medieval city. The ceiling is low, the walls glisten faintly with dampness. The air smells faintly of iron, clay, and age. This is not a dungeon, though it once might have been. It's an archaeological site, uncovered centuries later, and here, beneath the cobblestones of Europe, lie the traces of medieval justice, some baffling, some chilling, and some simply strange. Beneath many old European towns, London, Prague, Nuremberg, Florence, archaeologists have found rooms like this one, small, windowless, with heavy rings set into the walls. Sometimes there are markings scratched into the stone, tallies, initials, or prayers. They were once parts of medieval court complexes holding cells, record rooms, or storerooms for the tools of justice. Imagine the flicker of a tallow candle against rough limestone, the sound of chains clinking faintly as a guard shifts his weight. Above, the murmur of a court hearing echoes down through cracks in the floorboards. Accusations, verdicts, confessions. Down here, silence, and the slow passage of time. Over centuries, these chambers were filled, emptied, repurposed. Some became wine cellars, others forgotten entirely until, in the 20th century, workmen or archaeologists unearthed them once again. They found ledgers half decayed, iron manacles, fragments of seals, and most haunting of all, tiny scraps of writing. One in York, another in Lubeck, one preserved almost by accident in Paris, a slip of parchment wedged behind a wooden beam, containing a list of names and the Latin phrase Deus videbit, God will see. No one knows who wrote it, but it's easy to imagine someone waiting here, beneath the courtrooms above, whispering the same words to themselves. In several towns, justice wasn't only seen, it was heard. Across medieval Europe, cities kept special bells of judgment, rung to summon people to public trials or to announce the start of a punishment. Archaeologists have identified bell towers whose foundations predate the churches beside them, suggesting that they began as civic structures. In Cologne, one bell bore an inscription, "For truth and fear." In Ghent, another was called Roland, and it rang for both celebrations and executions alike. It's strange to think that the same deep sonorous tone that once called people to markets and festivals could also summon them to witness justice. A sound that united life and death, fairness and fear. Even now, if you visit some of these cities, the old bells are still there. Their tones have mellowed with age, their meanings softened, but somewhere in that low vibration, you might still sense the ghost of those older, more solemn gatherings moments, when law was both spectacle and prayer. For medieval Europeans, justice was not meant to be hidden, it was performed. Town squares often doubled as courts and stages. The pillory, the wooden frame that held the hands and head, was placed in plain view, so that punishment became a lesson for everyone else. But here's where archaeology tells us something curious. Excavations in several towns like Bruges and Avignon have shown that many of these public punishment sites were remarkably well decorated. Cobblestones arranged in careful patterns, steps carved with ornate flourishes. Even the wooden platforms, reconstructed from written descriptions, were sometimes painted or lined with cloth. Punishment, it seems, had a kind of ritual dignity. It wasn't simply humiliation, it was theater, part of the rhythm of civic life. Citizens would gather, not to gawk cruelly, but to witness the reaffirmation of law and order. Children sat on shoulders, merchants paused their sales, priests stood by with psalms, and when it was done, life resumed. The baker opened his stall again. The bell fell silent. The cobblestones cooled in the evening air. The city exhaled, calm and orderly once more. Some of the strangest discoveries, though, have been scraps of forgotten law rules that seem nonsensical now, but once made perfect sense in context. In Florence, archivists found a decree forbidding anyone from hanging laundry on Sundays. In Paris, one law made it illegal for bakers to sell bread at nights, supposedly to prevent fraud under the cover of darkness. In Basel, a curious law banned the playing of dice in the company of students or clergy. And in one German town, a surviving record shows a law that required pigs walking the streets to wear decorous clothing. Why? Because loose animals were common in cities, and if a noble's horse tripped over your pig, you could be fined heavily unless you could prove your pig was well kept. So tailors made pig jackets, little capes of wool or linen, sometimes with bells, sometimes dyed in bright colors. No one thought it strange. It was simply another part of civic order. Imagine, if you can, the narrow streets of a medieval townstone, walls rising on either side, gutters running with rainwater, the air thick with smoke and bread and livestock, and among the crowd, a pig trotting politely along, wrapped in a neat red cloak. It's absurd, yes, but also oddly charming, a glimpse of humanity's endless attempt to make sense of chaos by writing rules, even the strangest ones. Not all discoveries are so light-hearted. Beneath a ruined monastery in France, archaeologists uncovered what they believe was a small ecclesiastical court. The walls were painted with faded frescoes, angels, and scales of justice, and, in the center of the room, a single stone chair faced a wooden table. It was likely a place where monks were disciplined by their superiors, silent, solemn, candlelit, the kind of place where one might confess to something small, neglecting a prayer, breaking a fast, and accept a penance. Even in this quiet setting, justice was ritual, a balance between mercy and rule, between confession and control. And when those institutions crumbled centuries later, the rooms were sealed, forgotten, and eventually rediscovered, filled with nothing but the faint smell of lime and dust. Many of the laws uncovered from that era seemed laughable, now impossible: fines for bread weights, bizarre moral rules about clothing, long-forgotten taxes on windows or chimneys. Yet beneath their strangeness lies something very familiar: the attempt to shape human behavior, to make life predictable, structured, ordered. Every rule, no matter how odd, was a fragment of that deeper desire. The archaeologists who brushed dust from those ancient ledgers are not just uncovering rules, they're uncovering the psychology of a civilization, a world where people believed that justice was not an abstract idea but a living force, built into the very fabric of daily life. And now, as we leave the dimness of the underground chambers, we climb slowly back toward the surface, toward light, toward air, toward the distant sound of music. Because above all this, there was another world entirely, a world of nobles, of rich fabrics and elaborate feasts, of law written for display rather than survival. If the peasants lived under law, the elites performed it. In the next and final segment, we'll step into that other realm, the candlelit halls of medieval courts, the polished manners, and the intricate etiquette that governed even the most powerful. The air changes again. Gone are the cold stones of the underground chambers and the faint drip of water. Now, you find yourself in a large hall filled with the soft glow of candlelight. The scent of beeswax and rosemary drifts through the air. A faint tune plays from a corner, perhaps a lute, perhaps just the echo of memory. You are no longer among peasants or prisoners. You have entered the world of the nobility, the people for whom law was not merely a restraint, but a performance, a way of life that defined their very identity. At first glance, the upper classes of medieval Europe seemed free. They had wealth, privilege, and power. They lived in homes filled with color and sound, wore clothes of fine wool and silk, and dined on spiced meats and sweet wines. But even here, perhaps, especially here, law seeped into every corner of life. These were the sumptuary laws, rules that dictated not what you must do, but what you must not do, what you could wear, what you could eat, and how you could show your wealth. The reasoning was simple: society must have order. If a merchant could dress like a noble, how would one know who was who? So in England, for instance, only certain ranks could wear fur. In Florence, only noble families could use cloth of gold thread. In France, only those of royal blood could wear purple. Imagine it for a moment. You are a prosperous merchant's wife. Your husband has worked hard. Your home is filled with fine cloth from Flanders and spices from Venice. You long for a velvet gown dyed a deep royal crimson, a symbol of your success. But the law says no. That shade is reserved for the nobility, so you choose a softer red. Still fine, still beautiful, but safely within the law. And as you walk through the streets, you pass a lady of higher birth, her dress gleaming with that forbidden hue. Neither of you speaks, but you both understand what the colors mean. Law, in the noble world, was not always written in books. Sometimes it was performed in gestures, in habits, in expectations so ingrained they might as well have been carved in stone. At a noble table, every motion was part of an unwritten code. You did not reach across the board. You did not speak with your mouth full. You did not wipe your hands on your sleeve. Cloths were provided for that. In some castles, it was forbidden to begin eating before the lord took the first bite, and no one, no matter how hungry, dared touch a morsel until the blessing had been said. The fork, now a simple tool, was once considered scandalous. In some places, its use was even frowned upon, dismissed as foreign, decadent, and unnecessary. Yet as centuries passed, the rules changed. The nobility began to define themselves by these very gestures, the quiet, deliberate elegance of control. And so, the act of dining became theater, a kind of living ritual of civility, as binding as any law. For commoners, marriage was a personal affair, a matter of love, survival, or necessity. For nobles, it was a contract of power, and it was heavily policed. Church law governed who could marry whom. No unions between close kin. no remarriage without dispensation, no secret weddings in the dead of night. Every joining of hands was a negotiation of land, titles, and legacy. In England, noble marriages required royal consent. In France, certain aristocrats needed papal approval. And in the great courts of Italy, marriages were arranged and rearranged like chess pieces, always in pursuit of influence. There were laws about dowries, about inheritances, about the legitimacy of children. And if you dared to break these codes, if you eloped or married beneath your station, you could lose everything. There are stories, tucked into the archives, of noble women disinherited for marrying men of lesser honor, of knights stripped of lands for secret unions, of lovers who defied these rules and disappeared from record entirely. In a world that prized lineage above all, love itself was a dangerous rebellion. For commoners, marriage was a personal affair, a matter of love, survival, or necessity. For nobles, it was a contract of power, and it was heavily policed. Church law governed who could marry whom. No unions between close kin, no remarriage without dispensation, no secret weddings in the dead of night. Every joining of hands was a negotiation of land, titles, and legacy. In England, noble marriages required royal consent. In France, certain aristocrats needed papal approval. And in the great courts of Italy, marriages were arranged and rearranged like chess pieces, always in pursuit of influence. There were laws about dowries, about inheritances, about the legitimacy of children. And if you dared to break these codes, if you eloped or married beneath your station, you could lose everything. There are stories, tucked into the archives, of noble women disinherited for marrying men of lesser honor, of knights stripped of lands for secret unions, of lovers who defied these rules and disappeared from record entirely. In a world that prized lineage above all, love itself was a dangerous rebellion. The law of appearances for the noble classes. The greatest law of all was appearance. A noble must never appear poor, never appear uncertain, never appear ungraceful. Even when war came, or famine, or plague, the image of control was sacred. Letters from the French court described nobles ordering silks even during times of siege. In England, during the Wars of the Roses, lords continued to hold lavish banquets, less to celebrate, and more to assure others that they could. Appearance was power, and law, both written and unwritten, reinforced that illusion. The very clothes one wore, the foods one served, the way one spoke, all of it was governed by centuries of expectation. The nobleman who dressed too simply was suspect. The lady who refused jewels might be whispered about, and the knight who failed to attend mass, or who neglected his duties at court, risked more than just gossip. He risked dishonor. In a way, this web of rules bound the upper classes as tightly as serfdom bound the poor. Only the walls were gilded, and the chains invisible. Justice among the privileged, and when nobles did break the law, justice took on a different tone. While peasants might face the stocks or the lash, nobles faced ceremony. Trials were conducted in private chambers, surrounded by heralds and scribes. Punishments were softened, mitigated, or delayed. A noble found guilty of theft might lose favor, not freedom. A noble woman accused of scandal might be sent to a convent rather than a cell. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was hierarchy. Law, for the elites, existed to preserve dignity as much as order. It was a strange balance. Mercy for the powerful, discipline for the powerless. But everyone accepted it as the natural order of things. After all, in a world that believed God himself had ordained each person's place, the law was simply an earthly reflection of divine structure. The quiet fade of feudal law as the centuries turned, though the walls began to crack. Trade grew. Cities expanded. Merchants became rich enough to rival barons, and ideas about fairness began to shift. The sumptuary laws fell first, too difficult to enforce, too often ignored. Then came the legal privileges of birth. Slowly, the hierarchy unraveled, replaced by newer systems, newer codes. But for hundreds of years, these strange, invisible laws shaped the rhythm of life, how people ate, dressed, prayed, and loved. They were as real as stone, and as fragile as parchment. The night falls on the medieval world, and so, as candlelight flickers across the carved walls of a forgotten hall, we step back from the world of nobles and peasants, courts and cathedrals. Outside, the sound of wind hums softly against the shutters. The great bells of the city have gone silent. The laws, written and unwritten, lie sleeping in the archives of memory. You can almost hear the quiet of a world that no longer exists, the distant sound of hooves on cobblestones, the faint rustle of silk, the echo of prayers in an empty chapel. All of it laws, punishments, hierarchies fading slowly into the dark. And as you rest here, suspended between past and present, it becomes clear that the strangest thing about those old laws isn't how odd they were, it's how human they were, each one an attempt to make sense of a chaotic world, each rule a fragile thread, holding together the fragile fabric of life. The world of the Middle Ages was built upon laws, written, unwritten, whispered, and feared. But unlike today's endless pages of legal codes and bureaucratic rules, the medieval mind understood law not as a set of rights, but as a divine order. To live under the law was to live within a grand design, a structure woven by God, church, and king. And for ordinary people, that design was often invisible until it tightened around them like a net. Imagine yourself in a small market town. The cobbled square is muddy from last night's rain. The wooden stalls smell of onions and fish, and the air hums with the slow rhythm of a day beginning. Here, laws aren't just something written on parchment. They live in the hands of the watchman, the frown of the priest, the taxes collected at the gate. A peasant didn't need to read the law to feel it. He could sense it in every tolling bell that marked time for work and rest, in every gesture of deference toward the manor, in every whispered warning about what must not be done. The medieval world believed chaos was always near. A bad harvest, a sickness, or a simple quarrel could spiral into disaster. Laws, even the strangest ones, were meant to hold that chaos at bay, to modernize, banning bright colors, controlling shoe lengths, or dictating what kind of hat a woman could wear seems laughable. But to medieval thinkers, these were acts of preservation, a way of keeping the fragile social hierarchy in its rightful order. Without them, they believed, the world might collapse into sin, confusion, and disobedience. The fear wasn't of crime, but of imbalance. In those centuries, religion wasn't separate from governance. To break a law was often to break with God. So when sumptuary laws declared that a farmer must not wear silk, it wasn't just about class, it was about humility before divine order. Silk was for nobles, because nobles were closer to God in the feudal chain. A serf in silk would be a world turned upside down. The kind of inversion the church warned would invite divine punishment. And yet, people found ways to bend these rules. A tailor might secretly stitch a bit of velvet inside a sleeve. A miller's wife might line her hood with faint gold thread. Quiet rebellions of texture and color, unrecorded in law books, but very much alive in daily life. These tiny acts of resistance reveal something profoundly human, the desire to be seen. Even in a world that told you where you belonged, in the hush of a candlelit cottage, the glimmer of forbidden cloth wasn't just vanity. It was a whisper of individuality, a soft rebellion against the order of things. Punishment, too, was part of the lesson. For breaking a market law, you might be set in the stocks. For disobeying a guild regulation, you might lose the right to trade. The punishments were public, not because they loved cruelty, but because visibility taught order. A fine would fade from memory, but shame lasted longer. The idea was not to destroy the wrongdoer, but to weave them back into the moral fabric, humbled, obedient, and visibly corrected. And yet, for all the harshness, these punishments carried a rhythm of predictability. People knew the boundaries. They understood, almost instinctively, what could not be said, what could not be worn, what must not be done on holy days. This predictability was a strange kind of comfort, the same comfort a modern person might find in routine. In a world where plague, famine, and war were constant threats, knowing where you stood was a form of safety. And so, they obeyed, not always out of fear, but sometimes out of relief. One of the least recorded, yet most powerful, laws of medieval life was the law of silence. There were things one did not speak of, the sins of a priest, the affairs of a lord, the doubts about relics. Silence was its own legal boundary, one that kept peace within the fragile threads of village life. Imagine sitting in a dim tavern, the rushes underfoot damp from spilled ale. Someone makes a joke about a local bishop, not cruel, but cutting. A few nervous laughs ripple through the room, then quiet. Eyes drift toward the door. Someone coughs, the subject changes. That silence is its own kind of enforcement. The law doesn't need to be written when everyone has already learned the price of words. In many ways, medieval law was theatrical. Trials were not quiet deliberations, they were performances of order. A village gathered to watch. The accused stood in a wooden enclosure. Priests intoned prayers, the air filled with solemn ritual. Even ordeals, those infamous tests of guilt, where a person might hold hot iron or be thrown into water, were not random cruelties. They were ceremonies of divine judgment. The idea wasn't to test the body, but the soul. And when, miraculously or not, someone survived, it confirmed what everyone already believed, that God himself upheld the law. The performance soothed the community. It told them the world was still aligned. Justice had been served, not by man, but by heaven. But the Middle Ages were long, and the world changed. As towns grew and literacy spread, people began to question the strange, inherited logic of their laws. Merchants became wealthy enough to dress like nobles. Craftsmen formed guilds that rivaled old aristocrats. Women in convents managed estates larger than some lords. The boundaries blurred. Laws once meant to preserve balance began to suffocate growth. And so, slowly, they cracked. Sumptuary laws fell into disuse. Trial by ordeal was abandoned. Markets found new freedoms. The world loosened its grip, one rule at a time. But in the cracks left behind, something new took root. The idea of personal right. For the first time, people began to ask, not just what must I obey, but what am I owed? It was a subtle shift from law as divine order to law as human agreement. That change would shape the centuries to come. Even now, remnants of those medieval rules linger. Dress codes, social etiquettes, the quiet hierarchies that still define workplaces or institutions. These are echoes of an older instinct to organize, to categorize, to preserve stability through rules of behavior. When you're told what not to wear in a certain space, when laws dictate what may be said or not said, when social standing is measured in subtle signals, you are, in a distant way, living under the descendants of those ancient laws. Modern life feels freer, yes, but also strangely familiar. Like the peasants who stitched hidden silk, we still find small ways to express rebellion within order, through fashion, speech, or art. And like them, we still crave the safety of knowing where we belong. It's easy, from our vantage point, to laugh at the absurdity of medieval restrictions, laws against eating certain foods during Lent, rules dictating sleeve width, prohibitions on dancing during certain feasts. But look closer, and they reveal something universal: humanity's desire for control in a world that rarely makes sense. A farmer in 1300 might not understand weather patterns or disease, but he could obey the laws. He could pay his dues, wear the right clothes, attend the right feast days. These acts were small affirmations of belonging, proof that he was part of something larger, something ordered. In that sense, medieval law wasn't just about punishment, it was about belonging. It told people, you have a place here, and so long as you stay within it, the world will keep turning. When the Middle Ages began to fade, sometime between the late 1400s and the early 1500s, it did not end in a moment. It was not a door closing, nor a candle being snuffed out. It was more like the slow brightening of dawn, soft, steady, inevitable. The strange laws that had once defined the medieval mind began to loosen, melt, and reshape themselves into something more familiar. And yet, if you listen carefully, beneath the hum of modern life, you can still hear their faint rhythm, the echo of parchment, the murmur of scribes, the measured heartbeat of a world learning to govern itself. Imagine, for a moment, a dusty chamber in an early Renaissance town, Florence, perhaps, or London. The room smells of ink and vellum. Shafts of light fall across a wooden desk, where a clerk dips a quill into dark ink, carefully recording the details of a new bylaw. He is not a priest, he is not a noble. He is a man of the city, part of a new order of governance that has slowly replaced feudal custom. The laws he writes are not decrees from heaven, but decisions made by men, by councils, merchants, and guild leaders. Something has changed. Where once law was seen as divine, it is now becoming civic. Where once it preserved hierarchy, it now begins, ever so faintly, to suggest accountability. It is no longer about who you are, but what you owe, what you can pay, what you can prove. And yet, the medieval ghosts still linger, the habit of obedience, the deep respect for authority, the quiet belief that order must always outweigh freedom. In this twilight between ages, you can almost feel the old and new worlds brushing against each other, like two pages pressed together in a book. Across Europe, The guilds, those medieval brotherhoods of craftsmen and merchants, became the heart of early modern order. Their rules were intricate and deeply personal. They told members how to work, when to rest, what prices to charge, and even what prayers to say before opening shop. To belong to a guild was to live inside a miniature world of law, complete, protective, but also suffocating. Imagine yourself as an apprentice baker in 1500. Your hands are dusted with flour. You rise before dawn to knead dough in the flickering light of an oil lamp. The smell of yeast and smoke fills the small stone room. You are tired, but proud. Every loaf you bake must meet the guild standards, the right shape, the right weight, the right mark. If you underbake or overcharge, you will be fined. If you miss church, you might be reported. If you quarrel publicly with another guildsman, you could be suspended. These rules, written in heavy Latin, hang in the guild hall, a reminder that freedom, in this world, still came at the price of conformity. And yet, for the medieval craftsman, it was a comfort. The guild watched over its members, cared for the widows, paid for funerals. Its laws gave shape to life, just as the old church laws once had. One world had ended, but another had quietly taken its place, equally structured, equally strange. As Europe's cities grew and money began to flow through trade, kings and queens saw a new power in law. Once, a ruler's command was enough, but by the 1500s, monarchs discovered that written law, sealed, archived, and enforced, could rule even after their voice fell silent. Royal decrees multiplied, tax laws grew, court systems expanded. The bureaucracy that would become the foundation of modern government was born in candlelight, among clerks and scrolls. But in these dusty archives, old medieval instincts still whispered. Laws still distinguished noble from commoner, man from woman, Christian from Jew. Punishments still carried ritual shame. The world had changed its clothing, but not yet its heart. There is something almost poetic in that. The persistence of belief, the slowness of transformation. The old world does not vanish in a storm. It fades, gently, one habit at a time. Even as kings gained power, the church remained a shadow behind the throne. Canon law, the church's own vast legal system, continued to govern marriage, morality, and even death. A medieval couple wishing to marry in secret could find themselves excommunicated. A merchant lending money at interest risked being accused of usury, a sin, not just a crime. And in monasteries, laws reached into every hour of the day, dictating when to wake, when to pray, when to eat, and when to fall silent. Picture it, a long corridor of stone, the sound of sandals on cold floors, the smell of candle wax and ink. A monk bends over a ledger, recording the abbey's accounts. The order is absolute, the rhythm divine. To him, these laws are not restrictions, but harmony, the perfect music of obedience. In that stillness, the modern mind begins to form, one that seeks order through discipline, not faith alone. The monastery is, in a way, the ancestor of the modern office, the school, even the courtroom. As the Renaissance deepened, scholars began to think of law as something that could be studied, not simply obeyed. In universities, students pored over ancient Roman texts, rediscovering the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great collection of Roman laws that had been forgotten for centuries. From these rediscoveries, Europe began to rebuild its sense of justice, not as divine whim, but as reasoned order. To medieval ears, this was a quiet revolution. Imagine a student in Bologna or Paris, tracing the lines of Latin with a trembling finger, whispering aloud, "Lex est ratio," the law is reason. That simple phrase carried the seed of modernity. For the first time, law was not just what the powerful said, it was something that could be debated, analyzed, and perhaps even improved. Still, the medieval idea of obedience did not die icily. Many rulers tolerated scholarship, but only within limits. Too much reason was dangerous. Too much change could unravel the fragile web of control. So the world lived in a balance, one foot in faith, one in logic. A delicate tension that would define Europe for centuries to come. The printing press changed everything. In the 15th century, for the first time in history, laws could be printed and shared widely. What had once been whispered or posted on church doors could now be copied by the hundreds. Ordinary citizens began to see the laws that ruled them. For the powerful, this was both a blessing and a danger. Knowledge meant accountability. If a farmer could read the law, he could also question it. If a merchant could own a printed charter, he could defend his rights in court. Slowly, quietly, the balance began to shift. The same world that had once enforced silence now found itself answering questions. And though centuries still separated this from democracy, the seeds were already there, printed in black ink, resting on paper, waiting for someone to read them by candlelight. Even punishment began to change. The public spectacles, the stocks, the whipping posts, the pillories began to fade from town squares, not because people grew kinder, but because rulers learned that quiet obedience was more useful than noisy shame. The law became less about visible humiliation and more about invisible control. Fines replaced floggings, records replaced rumors, prisons replaced public squares. The sound of the medieval crowd gave way to the sound of paperwork, a softer kind of authority, no less absolute. Imagine the quiet of a record office, shelves stacked high with parchment, each scroll a story of land, of debt, of wrongdoing, each written with the same calm precision as though writing itself could make the world behave. And then, sometime around the 1600s, something remarkable began to stir. In England, the Magna Carta, once a dusty medieval agreement between a king and his barons, began to take on new life. Scholars, lawyers, and commoners started to interpret it as something revolutionary, a promise that no one, not even the king, was above the law. Across Europe, whispers of similar ideas spread. The law, which for centuries had been a tool of obedience, began to turn into a shield of protection. Imagine that, the same laws that once bound people to silence, now being used to give them a voice. It is one of history's quiet miracles. And yet, even as freedom grew, the medieval rhythm of obedience never fully disappeared. We still crave order. We still fear chaos. We still write laws to make sense of uncertainty, to draw lines in the shifting dust of time. In the end, history's strangest truth is that even as centuries pass, human beings remain the same, cautious, curious, and endlessly searching for balance between freedom and control. The medieval laws, bizarre as they were humanity's first great experiment in social structure. They taught us how to coexist, how to compromise, how to belong. They were crude, yes, but they were also the roots of everything we now call civilization. And perhaps that is their hidden beauty. Beneath the odd punishments and outdated customs, beneath the rigid hierarchies and forgotten decrees, there was a kind of order, an ancient lullaby sung by the world to itself. It told us, stay close, follow the rhythm, and life will make sense. And in that soft promise, the medieval world still speaks to us across parchment and time. The world of laws has changed, but the longing for balance between chaos and peace, between rule and freedom, remains eternal. It is what keeps civilization breathing, century after century. And perhaps, as you drift into sleep now, you might find a strange comfort in that every rule, every ritual, every quiet obedience of the past was simply humanity's way of holding the dark at bay. As the medieval world moved slowly through its centuries, laws did not only guard the streets or govern the markets, they also crept quietly into the most private corners of life, into the chambers of love, into the vows of marriage, into the secrets of the heart. To live in medieval Europe was to be watched not only by your neighbors, your lord, or the king, but by the church itself, a powerful institution that sought to define what was proper, holy, and acceptable in the realm of human affection. Imagine, for a moment, you were sitting in a dimly lit chapel, its walls smelling faintly of incense and old stone. A priest stands before you, reading from a parchment. You have come to be married, but he pauses, frowning slightly, because someone in the village whispered that you and your intended might be related by blood, perhaps cousins or second cousins. The priest shakes his head. The marriage cannot proceed without permission from the bishop. In the medieval mind, marriage was far from a private affair. It was a social and moral contract, one that touched on property, inheritance, and sin. And it was governed by a labyrinth of rules that seem, to modern eyes, almost impossible to navigate. The forbidden bonds for centuries. The church forbade marriage between people related within 7 degrees of kinship. That's not just your immediate family. It reached back to great-grandparents. Practically speaking, in a small village of a few hundred souls, it was nearly impossible not to be related to someone at least distantly. The result was a society in which marriages often had to be examined, questioned, or annulled simply because someone found out that a bride's grandmother's cousin once shared an ancestor with the groom's uncle. To the church, this rule was about purity, not of race or wealth, but of moral order. Marriage was sacred, and even a faint hint of incest, however innocent or unintentional, could bring divine disapproval. Over time, though, as this restriction proved utterly impractical, the church quietly reduced the number of forbidden degrees to 4, and later to 3. Still, the process of proving one's eligibility to marry could be as complex as a trial. The ban's public announcements of love to prevent secret unions or unlawful matches. The church developed a custom known as reading the banns. For 3 consecutive Sundays before a wedding, the names of the bride and groom were announced in church, giving anyone in the community the chance to raise objections, whether for kinship, prior vows, or other reasons. So, if someone had once seen you flirting with another person, or heard a rumor that you had been married before, even informally, they could step forward and challenge your right to marry again. A single objection could delay your wedding for months, even years. The banns were a public declaration of what was once private, a way for love to be weighed, measured, and approved by society. Love, lust, and the law, not all unions, however, followed the rules. Some were made in haste, others in secrecy. There were cases of clandestine marriages, where couples exchanged vows privately, often without witnesses or priests. Legally, if both parties consented, the marriage was considered valid, even without ceremony. But the church disapproved. Such unions were hard to regulate, and could lead to disputes over inheritance or legitimacy. Imagine 2 lovers whispering their vows in the shadow of a church wall, and years later, one denying it ever happened. Without proof, the other might lose everything. The medieval law books record countless cases of such promises. A man accused of seducing a woman under the pretense of marriage. A woman suing to prove that her whispered vows had been real. These cases were tried, not in royal courts, but in ecclesiastical courts, where bishops and priests acted as judges. Love, in the eyes of the medieval church, was not merely an emotion, it was a matter of law. When desire stepped outside the bounds of marriage, punishment followed, though not always in ways we'd expect. Adultery, for instance, was treated differently depending on your social class. For a peasant, it might mean public shaming, being paraded through the streets with a sign confessing your sin, or sitting on the cucking stool before the village. For nobles, the matter was more private, but often far harsher in consequence. A noble woman accused of infidelity could lose her dowry, her home, even her life. There were also laws governing how men and women could interact before marriage, courtship, flirting, even hand-holding. These could all be scrutinized under the watchful eye of both church and custom. In some towns, an unmarried couple found alone in a room could be presumed to have sinned, and might be fined or forced to marry. In England and France, church courts became the moral police. They summoned men and women for gossip, for secret meetings, for lingering too long in a shadowed corner after Mass. Some were made to swear never to see each other again. Others were assigned long acts of penance, fasting, prayer, or pilgrimage. It was a world in which desire was dangerous, and even the whisper of impropriety could stain a reputation for life. Despite the poetic songs of troubadours and the legends of courtly love, marriage in medieval Europe was rarely about romance. For most, it was about property, alliances, and survival. Among peasants, it meant joining labor and land, 2 people working together to till fields, raise children, and pay rents. Among nobles, it was a transaction between families, carefully negotiated through letters and envoys. Daughters were assets, sons were heirs. Love might come later, or not at all. Yet, even in this practical world, affection existed. There are letters from medieval husbands who wrote with tenderness, calling their wives sweetheart or dear companion. There were widows who refused to remarry, saying their hearts belonged to their lost husbands. In monasteries, monks and nuns struggled with feelings they were forbidden to express, writing poetry in secret, confessing temptations to their confessors. Human emotion, it seems, found its way through every wall the law tried to build. Medieval law extended even further into the realm of the body. In some places, laws dictated not only who you could marry, but how often you could be intimate. Certain days, Sundays, holy days, Lent, were forbidden for marital relations. It was believed that conception on these days brought divine displeasure. or that children conceived during such times might be born cursed or deformed. There were even laws governing attire, sumptuary codes that applied to married women. In some Italian city-states, a married woman could only wear certain colors to mark her status. Prostitutes, by contrast, were required by law to dress differently, sometimes in yellow veils or striped clothing, so they could be easily identified and avoided by honorable men. It was a moral landscape, policed through fabric, silence, and ritual. To be married, or not to be, was to live within an invisible maze of expectation. Despite the rules, history records countless tales of forbidden love that defied them. In 12th century France, the philosopher and teacher Peter Abelard fell in love with his student, Hilot. Their affair was passionate, intellectual, and utterly scandalous. When Hilot became pregnant, they married in secret to save her reputation. But her family, enraged, sought revenge. Abelard was attacked, castrated, and forced into monastic life. Hilot joined a convent, yet their letters filled with longing, sorrow, and deep affection survived the centuries, speaking of a love that endured even through law, pain, and time. In England, King Henry II's relationship with Rosamund, Clifford, often called Fair Rosamund, became the subject of legend. Though married to Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry built a hidden retreat for Rosamund in the woods of Woodstock, surrounded by a labyrinth so complex that only he could find her. Whether the story is true or not, it captured the medieval imagination, the idea of love so strong it had to hide behind walls and mazes. These stories remind us that, despite the weight of law and sin, the human heart remained untamed. Even in the age of parchment and penance, people found ways to love as they wished, and to suffer for it. Medieval Europe was fascinated by public humiliation. Where today we might find someone or imprison them quietly, medieval communities preferred spectacle. The punishment was often designed not to destroy the body, but the reputation. An adulterous couple might be tied together and paraded through town. A man caught with another's wife might be forced to wear ridiculous clothing, a symbol of mockery. A woman accused of gossip could be made to wear an iron scold's bridle, a cage over her head with a metal piece to hold her tongue still. These punishments served as warnings, but also entertainment. They reaffirmed the moral order in a time when the Church's word was law. And yet, looking back, there's something deeply human about them. The way fear, shame, and curiosity intertwined in the medieval soul. As the candlelight fades in your imagined medieval room, you might think about how these laws, so distant and strange, shaped the rhythm of ordinary lives. Every touch, every whisper, every marriage, all weighed, measured, and recorded in the name of morality. The medieval world was one of paradox. Public life was ruled by order, yet desire was endlessly unruly. The Church sought to control the body, yet the body quietly rebelled. Laws forbade love, yet love persisted in hidden glances, in letters smuggled under cloaks, in hearts that refused to obey parchment. And so, even among the bizarre laws of the Middle Ages, we find something tender, a truth that law could never fully conquer. That, perhaps, is what makes these old rules so fascinating to us today. They reveal a world that tried to regulate the most unpredictable force of all, the human heart. The world of medieval Europe was not only governed by kings and priests, it was defined by hierarchy. Every person, from peasant to noble, lived within an invisible ladder of obligation. Power flowed downward like rain, while duty and taxes flowed up. Yet, even at the highest rungs of society, life was still bound by rules, both written and unwritten. The lords and ladies of the realm, wrapped in silk and crowned with gold, lived under laws that shaped their every gesture, every feast, and every alliance. Imagine, if you will, the echo of footsteps in a long, cold hall. Stone walls hung with tapestries, their woven colors dim under candlelight. A nobleman stands at the head of a grand table, heavy with roasted meat and polished goblets. Servants move silently through the hall. Every movement, every word, even the way he holds his cup, follows a set of expectations older than he is. This was not freedom, as we might imagine it. It was a performance, a constant, ceremonial dance, choreographed by law, custom, and the watchful eyes of court. Among the nobility, there existed a strict code, a hierarchy so precise that even the act of sitting down was regulated. At royal feasts, the seating order was not casual. Each position reflected status, lineage, and favor. To sit too close to the king without invitation was not merely impolite, it was a challenge to authority. There were laws, spoken and unspoken, that protected the dignity of the crown, and even fashioned the shimmer of silk. The cut of a sleeve was policed. The sumptuary laws, which once restricted commoners from dressing like nobles, also told the nobles how they could display their rank. A knight could wear cloth of silver, but only a baron might wear ermine trim. A duke's garments could be lined with fur of lynx or sable, a silent, shimmering declaration of status. These rules were about more than vanity. They were meant to preserve the structure of the world itself. In a time when rank was everything, clothing became a form of social control, a way to make the invisible hierarchy visible. But sometimes, that hierarchy was challenged. The entire medieval social order rested upon one elegant, fragile idea: the feudal contract. At its simplest, it worked like this. The king granted land to his lords in exchange for loyalty and service. Those lords, in turn, granted smaller parcels of that land to knights or minor nobles who owed them military support. At the bottom were the peasants bound to the land, owing labor to those above. It was not a democracy, nor was it chaos. It was a web, each thread dependent on the others, held together by promises made in candlelight, by oaths sworn on relics, by the belief that the order of the world mirrored the order of heaven. Yet, this system was always under tension. A weak king could not enforce his will. A powerful baron could defy it. When loyalty broke, wars followed. In England, the feudal web unraveled spectacularly in 1215, when angry barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. This great charter was meant to limit royal power and protect the rights of the nobility. It did not create freedom for the common people, but it planted the first quiet seeds of accountability. And so, even in the candlelit world of castles and banners, the law was evolving, reshaping the balance between power and justice. For the nobles who lived within the walls of castles, daily life was a kind of stage. There were laws for warfare, laws for property, and even laws for courtesy. At court, the smallest gestures could mean everything. A misplaced word might be taken as insult, a late bow as defiance. Manuals of behavior were written to teach nobles how to act, how to eat without offense, how to speak with grace, how to flirt without impropriety. One 14th century guide advised noblemen never to lick their fingers at table, never to gnaw at bones, and never to wipe their hands on the tablecloth. Another warned against spitting too close to another guest. In a world where the body was seen as a mirror of the soul, even table manners were moral acts. For noblewomen, the expectations were even tighter. They were to be graceful but not vain, educated but never arrogant, gentle but capable of command. Many were married off as pawns in political alliances, their lives governed by laws that saw them not as individuals, but as links between families. Yet, within these constraints, noblewomen often wielded quiet power. They managed estates, arranged marriages, even negotiated treaties. Queens and duchesses became advisors, regents, and patrons of art. Their influence, though often hidden behind veils and courtyards, shaped kingdoms as surely as swords did. Laws of inheritance and the weight of blood in noble families. The greatest concern was not love or comfort, but succession. The law of inheritance, known as primogeniture, dictated that the eldest son would inherit his father's title, lands, and wealth. The younger sons were left to seek their fortunes elsewhere, in the church, the army, or through marriage. For daughters, the path was even narrower. They could inherit only if there were no sons, and even then, their rights were often contested. Marriage was their means of alliance, their dowry, a transaction that could seal peace or spark conflict. This obsession with lineage sometimes bordered on paranoia. A noble family's future depended on a single child surviving infancy, marrying well, and producing heirs. The result was a world anxious about bloodlines, a world where family trees were guarded like holy relics, and where rumors of illegitimacy could destroy dynasties. It was in this climate that countless disputes arose. Noblemen challenged one another's titles. Cousins quarreled over estates. In some cases, kings intervened to decide who truly inherited a claim. Each decision shaped the map of Europe, and beneath it all was a simple truth. The law, like power itself, was written in favor of those who already held it. But even the mighty could fall under the weight of the law they helped create. One of the strangest features of medieval justice was its obsession with oaths. To break an oath was not just dishonorable, it was criminal. And for nobles, whose power rested on sworn promises, an oath broken could mean ruin. Take, for instance, the story of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Though born to a modest family, he rose through loyalty and skill to become one of King Henry II's closest allies. But when the king sought to control the church, Becket refused, invoking divine law over royal will. Their friendship shattered into enmity. In 1170, Becket was murdered in his own cathedral by knights loyal to the king, an act that shocked Europe. Yet in death, Becket became a martyr, and Henry, consumed by guilt, was forced to kneel in public penance. It was a moment that revealed how fragile noble power could be, how quickly favor could turn to fury, and how law could become a weapon. Even kings too lived under this shadow. When monarchs ruled unjustly, rebellion often followed. In France, the imprisonment of nobles during the reign of Philip IV set off waves of unrest. In England, Richard II's tyranny led to his own deposition. And everywhere, in castles and courts, the great men of Europe learned to fear the same system they used to control others. We often imagine knights as noble figures, brave, loyal, and honorable. But in truth, chivalry was less a reality and more an ideal. The laws of chivalry were never written in any single code, but they were taught in stories, in oaths, in the rituals of knighthood. A knight was to protect the weak, honor his lord, and defend the faith. But on the battlefield, these ideals often disappeared in the smoke and mud. Still, the language of chivalry persisted. It was used to justify wars, to glorify violence, to paint conquest as virtue. Yet it also softened the rough edges of nobility. Tournaments, pageants, and feasts all became ways to display discipline and elegance, the illusion of peace amid constant conflict. Knighthood had its own legal privileges. A knight could demand trial by peers rather than commoners. He could wear his sword even in the king's presence. But with these privileges came duty, the expectation to serve in war, to answer the king's call, to uphold his family's name. It was a system built on honor, and honor was often a fragile thing. For the elite, excess was both a privilege and a sin. In medieval cities, the growing merchant class began to rival nobles in wealth. Alarmed, rulers issued new sumptuary laws to protect the visual order of society. Merchants could own gold, but not wear it. Their wives could wear silk, but not jewels. Even the number of dishes served at a banquet could be restricted by law. In Florence, a city famous for its beauty and wealth, a merchant caught wearing velvet reserved for nobles could be fined heavily. In England, a law of 1363 declared that no man below the rank of knight could wear fur or cloth of gold. And in France, under Philip the Fair, the law dictated that shoes could not have excessively long toes, a symbol of vanity and pride. Yet, just as often, these laws were ignored. Nobles flaunted them in subtle ways, and merchants bribed officials for exemptions. The rich, it seemed, were as restless under restriction as the poor. By the late Middle Ages, the old web of feudal obligations began to fray. The Black Death had wiped out vast portions of the population. Peasants, suddenly scarce and valuable, began to demand wages rather than mere subsistence. Kings, too, began to centralize power, creating royal courts that bypassed local lords. The law, once a patchwork of local customs, was slowly becoming something more unified. Judges began to record precedents. Scholars studied Roman law and canon law in universities. Europe was, in a sense, waking from the medieval dream, turning its gaze from the divine to the human, from feudal bonds to civic order. And yet, even as the old system faded, its echoes remained. The idea that law should preserve order, that rank should define privilege, that appearance should reflect virtue, all these threads still linger in our modern sense of society. As we draw this journey toward its quiet end, imagine once more the great hall of a medieval castle. The candles burn low, the tapestries stir faintly in a cold draught. A nobleman, weary after a feast, rises to retire. His servants bow, his knights murmur their farewells. The echo of his footsteps fades into the dark corridor beyond. Outside, the night is silent. The world, peasants, merchants, bishops, kings, sleeps beneath the same stars. And perhaps, in that stillness, one can sense the strange balance that held the medieval world together. Power and humility, glory and restraint, privilege and fear. The laws that ruled it, bizarre, rigid, and sometimes beautiful, were not just chains. They were the scaffolding of a fragile order, an order that would, in time, give way to the modern age, but whose quiet echoes still whisper through our history, and perhaps through our dreams. Imagine the sound of a quill scratching faintly across parchment. A candle flickers beside it, its light soft and uneven, casting long shadows across the narrow table. The scribe bends low, dipping the nib again into the ink, and continues to write in careful, measured strokes. Each word he copies is law, not divine scripture this time, but the rules of men. Rules that reached into every corner of medieval life. Even the quiet, the mundane, the small. Because in the Middle Ages, law was not some distant decree handed down from lofty courts or kings. It lived in every village. It whispered in every trade, every craft, every vow. And for most people, those laws were not about crime or punishment. They were about belonging. They told you where you fit, what you could wear, how you could work, and even how long you could rest. The guild's a world of rules in miniature. If you had lived in a medieval town, your life would likely revolve around a guild, a brotherhood of people who practiced the same craft. Bakers, weavers, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, candlemakers, even barbers all had their guilds, each with its own set of rules. Joining a guild wasn't simply about making a living. It was about living correctly, according to the standards of your craft and community. Apprentices learned early that rules were not suggestions. You woke before dawn, worked beside your master until nightfall, and rarely earned a coin of your own. If you spilled beer while carrying it for the masteress wife, that might be a fine. If you spoke rudely in the workshop, another fine. Even laughter, sometimes, was measured by propriety. Some guild laws bordered on the strange. The bakers of Paris, for instance, were forbidden from baking at night without a watchman, a rule born from fear of fires. In Cologne, if a butcher sold bad meat, he might be forced to parade through the town with the spoiled carcass hanging around his neck. In London, candlemakers who sold wax mixed with cheaper tallow were punished not by jail, but by humiliation, made to stand in the marketplace holding their dishonest wares aloft. These rules, while peculiar to modern eyes, gave medieval towns a kind of rhythm. They kept trust alive in a world where trade depended on reputation. They turned labor into ritual, a predictable, almost sacred pattern that offered security in uncertain times. Imagine the stillness of a cold morning in Bruges, the cobblestones slick with mist, the sound of wooden shutters creaking open. From one narrow shop drifts the smell of yeast and flour. From another, the metallic temps of hot iron. Each sound, each scent, follows a law older than memory. The silent agreement that to live in this town is to obey. Monastic rules, the quiet laws of silence and prayer. If you were not a craftsman, you might have lived under a very different kind of law, one not of trade, but of devotion. The rules of the monastery were some of the most intricate and demanding in the medieval world. Monks lived by a strict code, known as the Rule of St. Benedict, a document that governed almost every moment of the day. When to wake, when to pray, when to eat, when to work, when to sleep. Nothing was left to chance. Even silence was regulated. Some monasteries banned speech altogether outside the chapel. Imagine it. The bell tolls at midnight for matins. You rise from your straw bed, shivering as your bare feet touch the cold stone. Candles flicker in the corridor as you join the slow procession to the chapel. No words, only the faint shuffle of sandals and the rustle of robes. For the next 2 hours, you chant psalms in Latin, ancient syllables that roll softly into the dark. And when you return to your cell, sleep, when it comes, is brief. The next bell rings before dawn for lords, then work, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, brewing ale, or caring for the poor. Every action was ruled by obedience. Even laughter could be a sin if it disturbed the calm. Meals were eaten in silence, often in dim light, while a single monk read aloud from a book, a voice to feed the mind as bread fed the body. The laws were not made to punish, but to tame desire, to make peace a habit, and life itself a form of prayer. There's something soothing in that, a world where everything, even the smallest act, has its time and place. No chaos, no noise, just the endless rhythm of bells and breath. Women and the laws of modesty beyond the cloister walls. Another set of laws shaped daily life, those made for women, and while not all were written, they were deeply enforced. In many towns, unmarried women could not wear certain fabrics or colors. Silk, for instance, was often reserved for noble wives. In Italy, gold-threaded veils were banned for widows, who were expected to dress in quiet tones of grey and black. Even hairstyles were regulated. Loose hair might be seen as immodest, the sign of a temptress rather than a respectable woman. In England, some towns went so far as to fine women who wore gowns that dragged upon the ground. It was seen as vanity, a waste of fabric, and a nuisance in narrow, muddy streets. The hem of a dress, it seemed, could be a moral issue. Then there were laws about property and inheritance. A widow could keep her husband's house only if she promised not to remarry, for remarriage might shift the ownership to another man. In some places, even her spinning wheel could be taken if the local lord claimed her dowry back. Still, within these boundaries, many women found quiet power. They managed businesses, ran inns, brewed ale, and served as midwives and healers. Their knowledge of herbs and childbirth made them indispensable, though the same wisdom could later be twisted into suspicion, whispered as witchcraft. The law, in its strange way, both confined and protected, and while we might find it unfair, for those who lived within it, it offered clarity, a map of life's expectations, drawn in ink and custom, the laws of food, drink, and rest. Among all medieval rules, perhaps none were as peculiar as those concerning food and rest, because even these, the simple pleasures of eating and sleeping, were governed by law. On certain holy days, eating meat was forbidden entirely, not just for monks, but for everyone. Fish became the great substitute, leading to a complex web of rules about what counted as fish. Ducks, geese, even beavers were sometimes declared fish by local bishops, simply to allow them on the table. In France, bakers were told how large their loaves must be. In England, alewives, women who brewed beer, could not sell a weak or spoiled brew, under penalty of being dunked into a cold river by the local pillory. In Germany, innkeepers were required to provide straw bedding for travelers. Failure to do so could earn them a hefty fine. Rest was no freer. In some towns, laborers were forbidden from sleeping past sunrise, and night watchmen were required by law to patrol every hour. In Venice, ringing bells after curfew was illegal, as was singing loudly in the streets. Silence, it seems, was a civic duty, and yet, all of these rules carried a certain care beneath their strangeness. They were meant to keep order, to prevent cheating, quarrels, or moral decay. They reflected a belief that life itself was fragile, and only through constant vigilance could a town hold together. The quiet comfort of rules from the outside. These laws might seem absurd, too many, too strict, too strange, but to the people who lived beneath them, they offered something vital: certainty. In a world full of plague, famine, and sudden loss, the idea that life could be ordered, that there was a right and proper way to live, was deeply comforting. You might not understand the laws, you might even resent them, but you followed them because they gave shape to the day. Because every fine, every custom, every whispered warning against vanity, or sloth, or laughter too loud, all of it said the same thing: you belong here, you are part of the pattern. As night fell, the guild halls closed their doors. The monks extinguished their candles. The last bell rang in the square, echoing softly through the narrow streets, and as the town settled into stillness, it rested not in freedom, but in order. An order written by human hands, preserved in parchment, and carried quietly through time. The sound of parchment being rolled and tied with a strip of twine. The faint hiss of a candle's flame going out. Somewhere, beyond the monastery wall, a bell rings, the hour, slow, deliberate, fading into the cool night air. That is the sound of an age ending, the quiet unraveling of a world held together by rules. By the end of the Middle Ages, the thousands of small, strange, and rigid laws that had once defined life across Europe began to soften. Some were quietly forgotten, others were rewritten, and a few lingered for centuries, like the faint echo of a song no one could quite remember how to sing. It did not happen all at once. Change, in medieval Europe, rarely did, but it began slowly, invisibly, in the same places where the laws had once been born: the towns, the monasteries, the fields, and the courts of kings. The end of guilds, and the birth of freedom to work. Imagine a cobbler in Florence. Late in the 1400s, he has worked the same bench his father did, following the same guild rules, the same fees, the same rituals, the same expectations, but something has shifted. Outside, the world is growing restless. Merchants now trade with lands across the sea. New money flows not from craft, but from commerce. The Cobbler's Guild still insists that only its members may sell shoes in this quarter of the city, but fewer people care. Customers go where prices are lower, where trade is freer. Bit by bit, the guild's authority begins to fade. The rules that once gave the craftsmen protection now feel heavy, outdated. Apprentices, once bound to serve for years without pay, begin to drift away, finding work in towns that no longer enforce the old codes. And as the guilds weaken, something new begins to grow: individual freedom. It was not yet the freedom we know today, but it was the start, a crack in the wall of old obedience, a small whisper that maybe, just maybe, you could make and sell what you pleased, without a parchment seal, without a master's approval, without fear of a fine for disobedience. The cobbler keeps working, the same soft scrape of leather against his knife, but for the first time, the rules no longer feel eternal. They are fading. The Reformation breaking the laws of silence, while craftsmen and merchants began to question their earthly rules. Others began to question spiritual ones. The monasteries that had once been the heart of medieval order, calm, structured, ruled by bells and prayer, became the target of reformers who saw them as symbols of corruption and rigidity. Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk, once followed the rule of St. Augustine, a life of poverty and prayer. But by the early 1500s, he was writing his own rules. His challenge to the church shattered not just theology, but law itself. Because in medieval Europe, the church and law were intertwined. To disobey one was to defy the other. When monasteries closed, thousands of unwritten rules vanished overnight. Laws of fasting, silence, obedience, and penance. Imagine those cloisters, once echoing with chants, now silent for a different reason. Books locked away, candles snuffed, rules dissolved. Monks and nuns left to find new lives, carrying with them the faint rhythm of bells that no longer rang. And for those outside the walls, the change was dizzying. No more confessions to enforce moral order. No more bishops deciding what you could eat on Friday or what you could wear on a holy day. A person's faith and their behavior became a matter between themselves and their conscience. Freedom again, slow, uncertain, but spreading like light beneath a door. The courts of King's law becomes power in the Middle Ages. The law had been local. Your town, your lord, your guild, your priest, each had their own rules. But as monarchies grew stronger, kings began to gather those scattered threads into their own hands. Royal law replaced village custom. Written decrees replaced oral tradition. The strange, colorful patchwork of medieval justice began to flatten into a single pattern, the beginnings of centralized law. It was, in many ways, progress, but it also carried loss. Gone were the village courts where disputes were settled by neighbors who had known each other since birth. Gone were the local customs, the rules about bread, or sleeves, or ale strength, or shoe sizes that had once given each town its unique flavor. Instead, there were national laws, uniform, predictable, efficient, but distant. A farmer in Normandy or a miller in Kent might find himself judged not by the habits of his village, but by a clerk who had never seen his fields. Justice, once a living thing shared around a wooden table, became parchment and wax and signature. The age of obedience faded into the age of paperwork, science and reason. The death of superstition laws. As the Renaissance blossomed, new thinkers began to question not just law, but logic itself. They asked, why are certain things forbidden? Why are people punished for what cannot be proven? Witchcraft trials, once common, slowly began to decline. The laws that had allowed accusations based on dreams, marks, or whispers were rewritten. By the late 1600s, reason, not rumor, began to take the place of fear. Physicians, scholars, and philosophers pushed back against the superstitious edges of medieval law. Where once an eclipse might have been proof of divine anger, it was now studied as science. Where once disease was seen as punishment, it became a problem to be understood. The same calm order that had once come from faith began to come from thought. Rules did not vanish, they simply changed their roots. A world ruled by scripture became a world ruled by ink and experiment. And yet, beneath it all, that same human desire remained, the longing to make sense of things, to find peace through order, the quiet ghosts of the old laws. But history has a habit of keeping traces of what it leaves behind. Even today, in some towns across Europe, echoes of medieval law still linger. In England, certain guilds still gather once a year to recite oaths written in Latin. In France, a few monasteries still follow the old hours of prayer, matins, lauds, prime, terce, the rhythm of the Benedictine rule. In small Bavarian villages, you can still find laws about how high a fence may stand, or how wide a street must be, written centuries ago. These fragments are like ghosts, faint reminders of the time when law was life itself, woven into every motion of the day. They no longer rule us, but they watch quietly from the margins of our history, like the faint outline of an old map beneath a new one, the gentle fall of an age picture. For a moment, a medieval scribe, the same one who began our journey, sitting alone in his chamber. His candle has burned low. The air smells faintly of smoke and wax. The book before him is nearly finished, the ink beginning to fade where he began hours ago. He writes one last line, not a law this time, but a note to whoever will read it next. This is the order of our world. May it endure. But of course, it did not endure. The ink dried, the parchment curled. The scribe's laws, like so many others, were forgotten. And yet, their spirit, the yearning for order, for structure, for meaning, never truly vanished. You can still feel it in the rules we follow now. Traffic lights, taxes, timetables. We have traded the lash of the guild and the silence of the monastery for the quiet bureaucracy of the modern day. And still, we obey. Not because we are forced to, but because we find comfort in the pattern. The night falls outside. The bell rings once more, not for prayer this time, but for memory. The medieval city sleeps beneath its layer of dust and time. The laws that once kept it upright lie silent, folded away in archives and forgotten books. And as we close this chapter, the world of the Middle Ages drifts further away, its strange rules softening into myth. The noise of the marketplace fades, the guild halls close their doors, and even the scribes set down their quills. All that remains is stillness, and the faint whisper of the laws that once bound it all together. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself there one last time under the slow toll of a monastery bell, the faint smell of ink and candle wax in the air, and the soft certainty that everything, every action, every breath has its place. The laws of the Middle Ages were not just rules, they were a lullaby for a restless world. And now, as you rest, their rhythm continues, steady, calm, and ancient, echoing gently across the centuries, guiding you to quiet. And so, as our long walk through medieval Europe draws to a gentle close, the echoes of that distant world begin to fade. The flicker of torchlight against stone walls softens, the sound of iron-shod boots on cobbled streets grows distant, and the hum of a marketplace, thick with gossip and barter, drifts into silence. You can almost imagine the cool stillness of a medieval night now. The faint smell of smoke from a hearth, the rustle of straw in the loft above a stable, the low murmur of a prayer before sleep. The people of that time, strange and familiar all at once, lived under laws that shaped their every breath, laws that dictated what they wore, what they ate, how they spoke, when they worked, and even what they believed. Laws that could crush or protect, bless or destroy. Yet, to them, this was not tyranny, it was order. It was the rhythm of existence, as certain and eternal as the turning of the seasons or the rise of the sun. From the humblest peasant to the grandest noble, everyone in medieval Europe lived within a web of rules, some carved into parchment, others whispered as custom. There was safety in that web, but also weight. It held the world together, but it also held people down. Imagine the farmer, waking before dawn, the air thick with mist from the river. His duties were not his own choosing, they were inherited, like the soil he tilled. He paid his dues, in grain, in labor, in obedience. But in return, he knew his place. The man as lord might never know his name, yet both were bound by the same system. Two notes in the same ancient song. That sense of belonging, of order, even under hardship, gave meaning to lives that were often short and difficult. To live by the law was not just a matter of survival. It was to live in alignment with the universe, with God, and with the centuries-old rhythm of mankind. We can almost hear that rhythm now, the toll of a distant church bell marking time, the rustle of parchment in a scribe's hand, the creak of a judge's chair in a candlelit hall. The world moved slowly then, and law, like time, flowed in long deliberate lines. What's remarkable, perhaps, is how familiar some of these ancient rules still feel, even across centuries. The medieval obsession with appearances, The belief that clothing reflected morality echoes faintly in the modern world. Quiet judgments, the idea that rank deserves privilege, or that law exists to maintain order rather than equality, still lingers in certain corners of society. And yet, the law was also a mirror. It reflected not only power, but aspiration. Behind the cruelty of punishment, the rigidity of hierarchy, and the superstition of custom, there was a yearning for fairness, for predictability, for justice. Even when the system failed, the dream of justice persisted. It is humbling to think that the same species capable of building cathedrals, of carving saints from stone, and of painting the heavens onto chapel ceilings, also wrote laws about the length of a boot's toe or the width of a sleeve. It speaks to something deeply human, a need to make sense of the world by defining it, to bring order to chaos through words and rules. When we study the bizarre and often laughable laws of the medieval age, the rules about how to bake bread, how to sell wine, how to bury the dead, we are peering into the anxieties of the past. Each law tells a story. A rule about bread prices speaks of famine and fear. A decree about clothing whispers of envy and pride. A punishment for blasphemy reveals both devotion and doubt. Behind each statute, a living world unfolds, one of worry, ritual, and resilience. For the medieval mind, sin and crime were woven together. To break the law was to disturb the divine order. And so, obedience was not only civic duty, but salvation. It is difficult, from our modern vantage, to imagine such faith in structure, and yet, in its own way, it was comforting. When life was unpredictable, when the harvest might fail, when war might sweep through without warning, the law stood as something solid. It gave the illusion of control, even if it was imperfect. And perhaps that is why so many of those old laws endured, in one form or another, for centuries after their writers turned to dust. By the late Middle Ages, however, the old world began to shift. The markets grew, the towns swelled. Merchants, craftsmen, and thinkers started to challenge the weight of feudal hierarchy. New forms of wealth arose that could not be easily taxed or controlled. Kings, sensing opportunity, began to build new systems of law. National courts, royal decrees, written codes. The church's iron grip began to loosen. The idea of authority slowly drifted from the divine to the human. And yet, even as the feudal world faded, it left behind an enduring echo, a belief that order, however imperfect, is preferable to chaos. A belief that society, to function, must be built upon agreement, on a shared illusion that rules can hold us steady. In that sense, the bizarre laws of medieval Europe, the ones that seem laughable to us now, were not so different from the rules we live by today. They were born from fear, from hope, from the desire to be safe, to belong, to make sense of existence. As you drift further into this quiet moment, imagine yourself once more in that ancient time. The air is cool and damp. A faint smell of wood smoke lingers. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, its voice echoing across a sleeping village. The stars above are dim but steady, and the moon hangs pale over the roof of a manor house. Inside, the hall is silent. A scribe has just put away his quill. The last candle flickers, its wax pooling at the base. Somewhere beyond the door, a guard shifts his weight, armor clinking softly in the dark. For a moment, time itself feels still. The world, vast and unknowable, rests under the weight of its own rules, ancient, imperfect, but enduring. And you, listening across the centuries, can almost feel that same rhythm. The slow, steady heartbeat of a civilization trying to find balance between chaos and order, freedom and control, faith and fear, modern comforts, ancient shadows as you lie here now, perhaps in the soft hum of the modern night, surrounded by warmth and quiet. It's strange to think of how far we've come, and how much remains unchanged. We no longer bow before kings, nor fear the decree of priests, but our lives are still guided by laws we rarely question. We move through invisible systems, traffic rules, tax codes, contracts, customs, trusting that they will keep us safe. And yet, the human heart remains as it was, searching for fairness, for meaning, for connection. The people of medieval Europe lived by laws that seem strange to us now, but they, too, were simply trying to make sense of their place in the vastness of things. They prayed, worked, and dreamed under the same sky, worrying over the same small human fears, of hunger, of injustice, of being forgotten. The past, however distant, is never fully gone. It lingers in language, in ritual, in the way we still look for order in the quiet chaos of life. So, as the last echoes of this story fade, allow yourself to settle into the stillness it leaves behind. The world of the Middle Ages, with all its peculiar laws and rigid order, was a world both alien and deeply human. Its people sought peace through structure, meaning through ritual, and justice through rule. They believed that by shaping law, they could shape life itself. And in a way, they did. From those candlelit courts and parchment scrolls grew the frameworks that govern much of our modern world, the very ideas of justice, citizenship, and governance. What began as the bizarre codes of kings and monks evolved, over centuries, into the laws we know today. But tonight, none of that needs to weigh on you. Instead, let it all drift. The sound of a quill scratching on parchment, the murmur of voices in a medieval hall, the distant toll of a bell marking another hour long past. Let those echoes fade into stillness. The laws of that world have ended, but their rhythm remains, soft, patient, eternal. A reminder that, even across 1,000 years, humanity is still bound by the same quiet desire to understand, to belong, to bring meaning to the passage of time. And as you breathe in the quiet now, and let your thoughts slow, the world both old and new grows gentle again. The candles go out, the quills fall silent, the night deepens, and history, as always, whispers you softly to sleep.